The Candyman took place on Halloween 1974 in Texas, USA. Welcome, everyone, to today's story, a dark and chilling tale about greed and betrayal. Today, I'll be sharing with you the story of Ronald Clark O'Bryan, a man infamously known as the Candyman, and the tragic death of his own son, Timothy. This case shocked America on Halloween night in 1974. When the poisoned candy O'Bryan gave to his son marked the tragic end of the boy's innocent life. But the horror didn't stop there, as what followed Timothy's death was the haunting appearance of a ghost that forever lingered in the shadows. Join me as we dive into this terrifying tale and uncover what truly happened on that fateful Halloween night. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Night. Tonight, the Texas sky was terrifyingly dark, like a thick black veil, with only a few faint stars shimmering sporadically. A chilly wind howled through every corner, swaying the pumpkin lanterns hanging on porches. Children in spooky costumes ran around, their innocent laughter shattering the eerie night. But among the crowd, one figure stood out with a strange, unnerving stillness: Ronald Clark O'Bryan. He walked slowly, tightly gripping his son Timothy's hand. The boy's eyes sparkled with excitement, unaware that fate was lurking behind his father's cold, distant smile. O'Bryan smiled, but his eyes were far from warm. They were cold, like a raven patiently waiting for the perfect moment to tear into its prey. "Dad, I want more candy," Timothy exclaimed, rushing toward the door of the next house. His knock echoed through the quiet space, and soon a woman answered, handing Timothy a piece of candy with a kind smile. The boy cheered, holding the candy in his hand, before running back to stand beside O'Bryan. But strangely, it was O'Bryan's own hand that discreetly slipped another piece of candy into Timothy's palm, a candy that had been carefully selected earlier, one he had kept in his coat pocket all evening. "Here you go, my love, enjoy," O'Bryan softly said. His voice was gentle, yet there was something unsettling about it. Timothy, without a second thought, grinned innocently before unwrapping the shiny paper and popping the candy into his mouth. In the stillness of the night, the fading footsteps of father and son echoed down the brightly lit street. A thin mist began to settle, cloaking the street like a ghostly shroud. O'Bryan said nothing, only occasionally glancing at his son, who was happily skipping along, unaware that each passing moment was a prelude to something terrible. The church bells chimed in the distance, each ring steady, like the heartbeat of someone gripped by fear. With every toll, O'Bryan's gaze grew colder. The darkness thickened, as if it were preparing to swallow everything whole. When they finally arrived home, Timothy was visibly tired. He dragged his little feet through the door, placing his full bag of candy on the table before looking up at his father with bright, joyful eyes. O'Bryan remained silent, his smile unable to hide the darkness in his soul. Timothy, blissfully unaware, had chewed the poisoned candy his father had given him. The innocent child couldn't possibly know that every sweet, sugary bite was laced with death. And the darkness, like a living entity, silently waited to envelop them all. Chapter 2. The Hoarse Cry. The night grew late, and darkness enveloped the small O'Bryan household. The wind whistled through the old curtains, like distant whispers from the shadows. In the living room, Timothy lay sprawled on the sofa, his eyes beginning to droop after consuming a pile of candy. The candy bag was empty, but the innocent smile still lit up his face. Completely unaware of what was about to happen, O'Bryan sat across from him, staring intently at his son. His eyes seemed haunted by something inexplicable, a cruelty and coldness that belonged to someone who had sold his soul to the darkness. His expression remained calm, but deep inside, his mind followed every fragile breath Timothy took, like a predator waiting for its prey to weaken. Time passed, and the only sound left in the room was the ticking of the clock. Suddenly, in the dead silence, Timothy began to stir. His eyes opened wide, staring blankly at the ceiling. A discomfort spread through his body, as though something wasn't right. He gently placed a hand on his stomach, wincing in pain. "Dad," Timothy's voice was weak and hoarse. "My stomach, it hurts." O'Bryan didn't respond, just watched his son with lifeless eyes. Timothy started writhing, his small body trembling on the couch. His lips turned pale, and sweat dotted his forehead. His breathing became labored, interrupted, as if his body was trying to fight off a storm brewing inside him. Then, all of a sudden, Timothy convulsed. His entire body was thrown into a terrifying spasm. His tiny hands clenched. His legs kicked wildly in agony. His soft groans turned into hoarse, inaudible cries. The whole room was swallowed by a wave of pain, despair, and guilt. "Dad, Dad, I can't breathe," Timothy gasped, his eyes wide open, filled with overwhelming fear. But O'Bryan just sat there, cold and indifferent, as if watching a bloody spectacle. Slowly, he stood up, walking over to his son's side. His hand touched Timothy's forehead, a gesture so haunting, not of a concerned father, but like someone checking the results of a deadly experiment. "Timothy, it's just a bad dream," he whispered, his words hollow, devoid of any emotion. But for Timothy, this was no dream. The pain was slowly stealing his breath away, each passing moment stretching into eternity. His small body grew colder, his breaths weaker and more sporadic. Timothy drifted into unconsciousness, his eyes shutting as if the darkness was about to consume him entirely. The last hoarse cry escaped the boy's lips, echoing through the night. Before everything fell into silence, Timothy stopped breathing, and the room became eerily quiet, with only the ticking of the clock counting the seconds. In the thick darkness, O'Bryan stood motionless, listening to the wind gently tapping against the window. The hoarse cries of Timothy still echoed in his mind, like a curse he could never escape. Outside, Halloween night continued. Children still ran and laughed in the streets, unaware that in a small house nearby, a terrible tragedy had unfolded, and evil now reigned, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal its horrifying truth. Chapter 3. The Curse of the Poison Candy. The morning after Halloween, Texas remained engulfed in a gloomy chill. Weak rays of sunlight tried to pierce through the mist, but they only added to the heavy atmosphere. On the streets, the pumpkin lanterns from the night before still hung in the air, like eerie faces silently watching, bearing witness to a horrifying secret that had just unfolded. Inside the small O'Bryan household, silence had replaced the joyful laughter of Timothy. The sofa where the boy had lain last night was now cold and empty. Only a lifeless body remained, his pale face resembling that of a ghost. His lips were purple, and his eyes were shut tight, as if he was still trapped in a nightmare from which he would never awaken. The wail of an ambulance broke through the quiet morning. Timothy's mother, unable to believe what was happening, sobbed uncontrollably next to her son. Neighbors gathered outside, peering through the gate, their faces filled with confusion. They whispered among themselves, wondering what could have happened to the boy who had been running and laughing just the night before. At the hospital, Timothy was rushed into the emergency room. Doctors scrambled, trying to save him, but every effort was in vain. They couldn't understand how a healthy child like Timothy could suddenly die in such a mysterious way. Everything had happened too fast, too unexpectedly. Finally, after an examination, the doctors discovered something horrifying. A large amount of cyanide, a deadly poison, was found in Timothy's stomach. Shock spread through the hospital. Rumors began to circulate throughout Texas. People started talking about the candy handed out on Halloween night, the candy that carried death. The curse of the poison candy, they whispered. Someone put poison in the candy, and now, no one is safe. The police immediately launched an investigation. The remaining candy in Timothy's bag was collected for testing, and fear grew as the results showed that some of the other pieces had also been laced with cyanide. The entire neighborhood was stunned and terrified. Parents frantically checked their children's candy bags, fearing that the deadly candy might already be in the hands of their innocent kids. Suspicion spread throughout the town. People began blaming one another, convinced that a deranged person had intentionally handed out poisoned candy on Halloween to spread death. But amidst the rumors, a darker shadow loomed, and the truth about the person behind the poisoning had yet to be revealed. Ronald Clark O'Bryan, who had calmly sat in the emergency room while his son took his last breath, was now surrounded by suspicion. He appeared grief-stricken, tears streaming down his face. But the investigators weren't easily fooled by his facade. O'Bryan had been the last one to hand his son the poisoned candy. And, most horrifying of all, they discovered that he had taken out a massive life insurance policy on Timothy just weeks before. O'Bryan's web of lies slowly unraveled. Meanwhile, The ghost of Timothy lingered like an unhealed wound, haunting the streets where he once played, and the houses where he had received candy. People began to say that on Halloween night, the boy's spirit would return, searching for the poisoned candy that had stolen his life. As the investigation dragged on, the darkness thickened. People began to believe that it wasn't just one madman handing out poisoned candy, but that the entire town was cursed by its own deeds. The crime of a wicked father had opened a gateway for something far worse. Every night, as darkness fell, the townspeople would hear the faint sound of small footsteps wandering outside their homes, and the ghostly whispers of Timothy echoing from the shadows. O'Bryan, trying to escape the truth, found himself unable to outrun his own shadow. Long, sleepless nights filled his life, haunted by the sound of his son's giggling, the cries he once ignored. With each passing moment, the grim truth tightened its grip, leaving him with no escape from the torment he had brought upon himself. Chapter 4. The Terrifying Secret. The Texas night grew thicker, like a curse enveloping the town, and no one could sleep peacefully as the wind whispered through their windows each night. The stories of Timothy were no longer just whispers between parents but had become a collective fear gripping every home. Beneath each withered pumpkin lantern, people spoke of a ghost hiding in the shadows, still searching for the poisoned candy that had stolen its life. Meanwhile, the investigation into Timothy's death delved deeper into the dark corners of the truth. The police realized that this case wasn't just a random poisoning by a deranged person handing out candy. Each piece of the puzzle was falling into place, leading to a conclusion more terrifying than any curse. It was Ronald Clark O'Bryan, Timothy's own father, who had orchestrated everything. The investigation became more intense as detectives uncovered suspicious financial transactions involving O'Bryan. Before his son's death, O'Bryan had quietly signed a massive life insurance policy for Timothy, with enough money to cover his overwhelming debts. And worst of all, he had purchased a significant amount of cyanide just before that fateful Halloween night. The first interrogation with O'Bryan took place in a tense, heavy atmosphere. He sat before the investigators, pale and trembling. As the questions piled on, O'Bryan maintained the sorrowful face of a grieving father, but his eyes could not hide the emptiness within, the gaze of someone hiding the truth. "Why did you buy cyanide?" one of the investigators asked, his dry voice echoing through the small room. O'Bryan swallowed hard, rubbing his hands together, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I don't know what you're talking about. I loved Timothy more than my own life." But the truth was as clear as the dark shadow O'Bryan had been trying to escape. The receipts, the trail he had left behind, all pointed to a man who had plotted to kill his own son for insurance money. The investigators knew O'Bryan was lying. The quiet tone of his voice, his avoidance of eye contact, these were the signs of an unforgivable crime. That night, when O'Bryan returned home, the house, already cold, became even more suffocating. He walked through the door, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as if afraid of something lurking in the shadows. The lights flickered, as though controlled by an unseen hand. And then, in the deathly silence, O'Bryan heard a soft sound, so faint it could barely be heard, like the quiet footsteps of a child. "Dad," a weak voice called out, hoarse and distant. O'Bryan froze, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. He turned, looking around, but no one was there. "Who's there?" he muttered, trying to calm himself. But then the voice came again, clearer, closer. "Dad, I'm here." Timothy's voice. It was unmistakable. O'Bryan stood up suddenly, his hands shaking as he grabbed the candle from the table. The flickering light was barely enough to push back the overwhelming sense of dread. He walked slowly down the hallway, each step feeling like he was sinking deeper into an endless nightmare. When he reached Timothy's bedroom door, the heavy wooden door creaked open slightly, revealing the darkness inside. O'Bryan hesitated for a moment before stepping in, and then he saw it. Timothy's bed, still neatly made from the night before. Yet strangely, there was an indentation, as if a child had just been lying there. O'Bryan trembled, his eyes darting around the room, too afraid to get any closer. And then, from the shadowy corner of the room, a soft giggle echoed, the innocent laugh of a child. But it was so chilling that it made O'Bryan's blood run cold. "Dad's secret? I know it," the voice spoke again, now clearer than ever. O'Bryan staggered back, his hand trembling as he held the candle. His eyes widened in terror as he saw the silhouette of a child in the corner. Glowing eyes staring at him from the darkness. It was Timothy, but this wasn't the happy, carefree child O'Bryan once knew. This was a ghost, a being broken by death, now returned to seek justice. "You betrayed me, Dad, you killed me?" Timothy's voice was now a hiss, reverberating through O'Bryan's mind. He could no longer escape. The dark truth of his crime was coming back to haunt him, tormenting him until his very last breath. In that house, the darkness was no longer just darkness, it had become the dwelling place of an unspeakable horror. And O'Bryan, with his heart racing, realized that he had awakened the ghost of Timothy, and now his nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 5. The Eternal Ghost. Night fell once again over Texas. But this was no longer the quiet, familiar darkness. Throughout the town, lights were turned off earlier. Windows were shut tight, as if everyone was trying to hide from a horrifying truth. The ghost of Timothy O'Bryan had become not only Ronald's torment, but the entire town's, like an invisible shadow looming over every corner. Ronald Clark O'Bryan sat in his empty house, his eyes hollow and filled with exhaustion and madness. He was no longer the composed, respectable man he once seemed, but a living corpse, haunted by the eerie giggles in the dark, the quiet footsteps that echoed every night. He knew tonight would be no different from the others. Timothy would come again, the distant voice, the haunting laughter, the feeling of his son's cold hand brushing against his shoulder. O'Bryan stood up, his eyes scanning the room aimlessly, desperately searching for a place to hide from the shadow that crept closer with each passing hour. Footsteps echoed. It was no longer an illusion, no longer the paranoia of a grieving father losing his mind. The soft yet deliberate footsteps were drawing nearer. Timothy was here, in the house, in the very space that O'Bryan once considered a safe haven. "You can't hide the secret anymore, Dad," the voice echoed, as if the darkness itself was speaking to O'Bryan. Ronald backed into the corner, his hands trembling as they gripped the living room door. He tried to close it, but it seemed that nothing could stop the presence that was drawing nearer. Timothy's eyes appeared before him, cold, accusing, demanding justice for the life that had been stolen from him. But this was no longer the Timothy O'Bryan once knew. This was a ghost, a being from beyond death, carrying the fury of a betrayed soul. "My ghost will always be here." Timothy's voice rang out, clear and chilling. O'Bryan screamed in desperation. "No, I had no choice. I just wanted everything to be better. I just wanted a way out." He mumbled like a madman, his eyes wild as he watched Timothy's shadow grow larger, engulfing the room. But Timothy wasn't interested in O'Bryan's meaningless justifications. His death wasn't an accident, it was the result of a cold, calculated scheme. And now, his ghost existed for one purpose only: to seek justice for the wrongful death he suffered. Laughter echoed through the room. O'Bryan felt the air around him grow colder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached for his throat, struggling to breathe, but it was as if an invisible force was tightening around him. Every shadow in the house seemed to come alive, the dark shapes on the walls stretching out like demonic arms, pulling O'Bryan deeper into the eternal night. "You killed me. Now, I won't let you rest." O'Bryan staggered back, his entire body trembling as panic consumed him. But there was nowhere to run. Everything around him had turned against him. The house that was once his refuge had become his invisible prison. The walls seemed to close in, and Timothy's ghost drew nearer and nearer. "No!" O'Bryan screamed, his voice full of despair as he felt death approaching. But his cries were swallowed by the darkness, heard only by the ghost of his son. And then, in the cold night, O'Bryan felt the icy touch of Timothy's small hand on his throat. The touch wasn't heavy, but it carried the chill of death. O'Bryan shuddered and collapsed to the floor, his body twisted, weighed down by an unseen force. The next morning, Ronald Clark O'Bryan was found dead on the floor, his eyes wide open, empty, as though they had seen something too horrifying to describe. There were no signs of violence, no marks, only the frozen terror etched into his face. Rumor had it that, just before his death, O'Bryan saw the ghost of his son one last time. And that's what killed him. The story didn't end there. Every year on Halloween night, people say that Timothy's ghost still roams the streets of Texas, letting out eerie laughter, searching for the poisoned candy that took his life. And in the house of the O'Bryan family, those brave enough to stay the night claimed to hear the soft footsteps of a child, along with a whisper from the shadows. "You killed me, Dad." The town never forgot that story. And the curse of the poisoned candy remains a nightmare that no one can erase. The story of Ronald O'Bryan and the ghost of Timothy has become one of the most terrifying cases, haunting everyone whenever Halloween is mentioned. A night that should have been filled with children's laughter was instead overshadowed by the darkness of crime. And to this day, Timothy's ghost still lingers, seeking justice for his tragic death. If you ever hear the sound of small footsteps outside your window on a cold night, remember, sometimes the darkness is more than just imagination. If you enjoyed this chilling story and want to hear more spooky, mysterious tales, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any content. Turn on the notification bell to make sure you're always the first to uncover the mysteries. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next spine-chilling story.